white clouds were flowing on above the rocks. The protagonist stood on the ground in front of the straw, which he leaned over to it, taking it in his hand. Lloyd was squeezing the straw in his hand. The guys approached the cave. The protagonist noted that this was the Rough and Gorge. The guys looked at the cave with a serious look. Brown-haired noted that at the very beginning of the novel, this place was mentioned as one of Xavier's goals, and the dark mage Ruffin was hiding there. Lloyd wondered how he dared to touch their soldiers. Brown-haired's face twisted into a furious grimace. He wondered if entering private property was equated to a sin. The knight entered the cave, taking hold of his blade. He told the master to follow him. Lloyd asked to wait for him. Xavier stepped on the magic circle with his foot. The protagonist grabbed the swordsman by the coat, pulling him towards himself. An explosion occurred in front of the guys. They stood with their backs to the hole in the ground. The knight asked if it was a magic trap. The protagonist looked at the guy in bewilderment, asking if he was sure he was a knight, knowing that he should calculate such moments in advance. Lloyd imagined the image of a wounded savior. He thought that in the novel, Xavier fell into the same trap when he was wounded and looking for cover. The knight slightly opened his mouth, which he canoed his way through the cave. Lloyd noted that Xavier never makes mistakes twice. The brown-haired man pointed his finger to the side, asking what he said. That the flow of mana there is unusual. I suggest using my technique there too. The swordsman closed his eyes and spread his arms to the sides. The protagonist said that in a natural environment, mana has a constant concentration in the atmosphere. Blue particles of mana were flying in space. The hero said that this way he would be able to understand where the magical traps were. The blue energy particles connected with each other. Lloyd noted that he felt an unusual concentration of mana. Xavier looked ahead with a serious look. The protagonist followed the knight with a smile. The blue-haired guy said that they should go there. The protagonist noted that his senses were well sharpened. The swordsman looked away wearily, thinking that he only does what he lies and insists. But now, everything is different. The protagonist threw the shovel over his shoulder, following the swordsman. Xavier wondered what was going on, adding that he predicts events before they happen. The swordsman continued to follow the road, wondering how, and he does not feel any special energy, but could it be such a powerful mana? The blue-haired guy pursed his lips, thinking that first they need to figure out what awaits them ahead. The boys canoed their way through the cave. The swordsman noted that they needed to save the hostages as quickly as possible. In the cave stood a man in black robes with a hood over his head, which he looked back with a serious look. The boy stood near a table with books. He wondered if the trap had worked and someone had come to them and who it could be. The man slammed the place book shut, saying that he would find out soon, which he approached the door. That he thought his preparations were complete. The man moved the lock on the door, thinking that his experiment would be successful. There were men in a locked room, the guy said he hoped. The mage pulled the guy out of the room by his hair, who begged for mercy. Then he threw the man into a magic circle. The mage picked up a scythe, looking in front of him with a terrifying look. He said that this was a magic circle that connected with hell and the merciless side of the Reaper. Why nung for it's me, for 100 days, in a vessel with blood and a young life. The mage swung his scythe, saying that it was perfect. The man closed his eyes, screaming loudly. The protagonist called out to the guy in the robe. The guy looked back with a crazy look. The brown-haired man looked at the guy with an enraged look, telling him not to touch him. Rufin put his hand in front of himself, creating a magic circle. He asked music that they were crazy people, wondering how they got around all the traps. The guy stood in front of Rufin, which a wall appeared in front of them. A wall soon appeared behind the guys. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, taking in air. Lloyd stood with his cheeks puffed out. The guys were ready for ballet. Rufin smiled maliciously, thinking that he would put them to sleep with magic and then get even. The protagonist's eyes began to glow green. He thought that he was a lively guy. The system notified that he would not feel red for 10 minutes. The brown-haired man began to furiously dig the ground, thinking that a couple of minutes would be enough for him because now he was no longer in an ant tunnel. Xavier began to rub his eyes. Lloyd noted that Xavier had never taken Medica on for insomnia, so no sleeping pill would work on him. Music. The protagonist dug a hole in the ground, knowing that he had already gone too far. The knight looked down with a serious look, thinking that he looked like a mole, and when the opportunity presented itself, he would laugh at it. The protagonist began to point his finger to the knight, thinking that he should quickly go there. The swordsman stood in the tunnel, swinging his weapon. Energy appeared around the blade. The knight thrust his blade into the wall. He used the explosion skill. A pillar of fire appeared in front of the magician, which he fell to the ground in horror, watching what was happening. A huge hole appeared in the ground. The protagonist's hand rose from the hole. Lloyd began to rise from the tunnel. He fell out of the hole, looking at the magician with a terrifying look, saying that he had never seen such a huge monster before. Rafalan bared his teeth, creating magic circles, thinking that he had never seen such a huge monster. The magician pressed his hands to the ground, creating a huge magic circle. A huge monster with 2 heads appeared behind the magician. The man smiled madly, thinking that even though his experiment had failed, this was his most powerful Kriya-on. A huge, terrifying monster stood before the boys. The mage thought that they should at least try to scratch his steel armor. The protagonist looked away in confusion, saying that they would have a hard me and his weak legs. Lloyd looked at Xavier in bewilderment, who jumped into the air. The swordsman delivered a fiery slashing blow to the monster using the skill-ripping wave. Xavier cut the monster in half. Rufflin watched in horror. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. He wondered if he could use the power of the explosion as an auxiliary force and cut in half. Xavier leaned slightly, pulling his weapon back in its sheath. Lloyd wondered, snorts, why the novel didn't mend on this technique. The boys stood in a pompous stance. The mage looked at the guys with horror, thinking that he was in trouble, and no matter what he did, he would not be able to defeat them. The protagonist squatted down next to the man. He looked at the mage with a terrifying look, saying that he had kidnapped their soldiers, and now their constructon had stopped because of him, asking how he was going to pay him. Rufflin bowed before the protagonist, thinking that it would be for him to lie down on the ground for now, because he had to survive by any means. The mage said that he had committed a great sin, and was begging for forgiveness. Lloyd noted that he should not say that, and he was asking about compensation for the damage caused. The man looked ahead with horror, saying that there were many valuable things there, and he would give them everything. The protagonist grinned slightly, asking that this was true, and therefore it was all his. The man said that of course he could take everything. Xavier pulled the worker out of the room by the arm, telling the master that the soldiers were severely exhausted, but their lives were not in danger. Lloyd said that was great, and he was glad to hear it. The protagonist looked at the mage with a cold gaze, saying that in a couple of days they would have been dead, asking what he was going to do with them. The mage bared his teeth, saying that he was doing research, trying to find out how to bring the dead back to life. The protagonist looked at the man with disdain, asking what was even possible and why he needed to know. The man narrowed his eyes. He continued to sit, bowing in front of the protagonist. Rufflin stated that it was to bring back his wife and son. The protagonist looked at the mage with a serious look. Rufflin remembered how he held his son in his arms with a smile and looked at his wife. He said that he was a mage in the house of a baron and lived an ordinary life with his family, and not just an ordinary one. He was happy. Rufflin imagined the baron holding out his hand, and then the happy picture cracked. He said that the baron he served, he suddenly wanted to take his wife away from him, so he tried to escape with them. The protagonist closed his eyes, opening his mouth wide. Rufflin said that the baron was chasing them. Lloyd told him to stop, and that he was good at sculpt nung. He looked at the mage with a serious look, asking what it meant. If he saved his wife and son, they would thank him for killing hundreds of innocent lives and saving them, and that he thought they would thank him like that. The man looked at the protagonist with bewilderment. The brown-haired man noted that the ghouls he created. The hero looked at the man with a cold look. He asked that the lives of the people he sacrificed, their families, their happiness, and for him at all meant nothing, adding that he did not think that his story deserved pity. Xavier watched the events with a serious look. Brown-haired man told him not to speak. His true nature cannot be changed. Music. Rufflin looked down with a sad look. Brown-haired man noted that he had destroyed the happiness of so many families, and he would forever remain a murderer. Tears began to flow from the mage's eyes. The hero pressed his lips together. He rose to his feet, saying that he would return later with reinforcements and take all of his magical items. The protagonist turned his back to the man, knowing that if he tried to harm anyone else, he should not expect mercy. The mage looked at the protagonist in shock, which he bowed before the protagonist again, thanking him. Lloyd stood with his back to him, pressing his lips together. He imagined the image of the swordsman behind the mage. Lloyd noted that in the novel, Xavier forgave Rafflian and lay the music cave. The protagonist presented the image of the disfigured mage, knowing that Rufan then killed hundreds more innocent people and experimented on himself, and he turned into an uncontrollable and annoying villain who challenged Xavier again and again. Lloyd took a step, knowing that even though he knew about it, he now turned his back on him because the mage's face was hidden under the hood. Rufflin peered out from under the hood with a terrifying look. Lloyd stood with his back to the man. The mage opened his mouth wide, creating a magic circle. He approached the protagonist with a mad smile, preparing to attack him. Lloyd looked behind him, looking at the mage with a frightening look. He asked the man if he had ever forgiven him. Ruffin looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. Music. The brown-haired man thought that he knew from the very beginning what this would lead to. Xavier attacked the mage, Sunung off his head. Rufflin's head bounced off the air. The man in the work uniform looked ahead with displeasure. He told the guy that he was nothing but trash, Rowan to the core, and when he greeted him, he should bow 90 degrees, asking if he understood. The protagonist noted that there was a dude who constantly swore for no reason. Lloyd remembered himself in his real world. When he nervously looked ahead, he noted that it happened every damn me. The Bruni bowed to the man, apologizing to him, knowing that he would be more careful in the future. The worker told him to keep his back straight. Lloyd noted that there was nothing wrong with that. One should avoid quarrels. One fight leads to another. The man turned his back to the guy, saying that the youth of their day have to be taught everything, and all they themselves know how to do is eat. The protagonist noted that if he was polite, then he would change with such thoughts. He tried to put up with the situa on. A bow-full orange sunset was visible in the sky. Lloyd asked what this led to. The Brune bowed to the man, greeting him. The guy stood motionless in a bent position. The man asked what he was at the demonstra on, Nonya, that he almost went deaf. The protagonist noted that he saw him as a punching bag. The man turned his back on the guy, saying how pathetic he was. Lloyd grit his teeth, thinking that he needed to hold on, and it would all be over soon. The guy bared his teeth, thinking that he needed to restrain himself, and if he made a scene himself, he would only suffer more, and he needed to relax. The worker stood with his back to the guy, saying that only a worthless mother could have such a worthless son. The protagonist widened his eyes in rage. The guy put his hand on the man's shoulder, which he bared his teeth and swung his fist. The Brune hit the man in the face. The workers looked back, watching what was happening, not understanding what had happened. Lloyd punched the man in the face, which he hit him again. The Brune kicked the man in the stomach. He noted that while he was hanging him, there was only one thought in his head, that he was doomed. The workers ran up to the guy, stopping him. The guy was carrying pipes on his shoulder. Lloyd asked what the result was. The guy looked ahead in surprise. The man looked at the protagonist with horror. Then he turned his head to the side. The Brune E stood motionless, looking at the man leaving. The protagonist noted that peace had come. The protagonist turned his back to the dead body of the magician. He noted that some means he should stop any violence, wondering if everything would be okay. Then the protagonist recalled the news on TV. He noted that there were a lot of serial killers and rapists in Korea, wondering why the most vicious criminals escaped punishment, and perhaps it was all about human rights. Rufflin's head was lying on the ground. Lloyd thought it was funny, but then the villain should get what he deserved. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The guys were walking along the road in the forest. The man was carrying a backpack on his back with an exhausted look. The protagonist looked back. The worker looked at the young gentleman in surprise. The brown-haired man said to give him his load before he collapsed. The man began to refuse the offer. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, saying that if he felt bad, he would have to carry both of them, so he should give it to him quickly. The sun's rays were breaking through the trees. Music. The young master said that all the men should quickly hand him their backpacks, knowing that this was an order. The workers looked at the young master in confusion, saying that they would carry them themselves, and how could such a noble man do this? The protagonist threw the backpacks on his back, saying that whoever was the most troublesome would not receive additional pay. Tears appeared in the worker's eyes. Xavier watched what was happening in bewilderment, thinking that he did not know whether they made it in the backpacks themselves or that he was genuinely concerned about the well-being of the soldiers, and he did not understand him at all. The soldiers looked at the young master with touched expressions. The knight thought that the truth was not important to the soldiers now. Lloyd carried the backpacks with a serious look. The swordsman thought that a leader they could trust and follow. That's what the soldiers thought of young Master Lloyd. The system announced that the freed soldiers were deeply touched by his actions, and some stories about him would be passed on by word of mouth. The protagonist pursed his lips. The system asked if it wasn't lovely. The protagonist looked ahead irritably, asking what was lovely. No, that he didn't need anything except money. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The iron doors to the stone-cold storage were open. Haraj looked around the room with curiosity, saying that this was the cold storage. The Chiane's son looked up uncertainly. He looked behind him, saying that it was only slightly cooler there than outside, and the meat would quickly spoil, and their muscles would lose their former strength. Lloyd said that it was only for now, and that was obvious. The protagonist smiled widely, knowing that it was because there was no ice, and they weren't done yet. The Chiane's son looked at the young master in confusion, saying that he knew what ice was, and it was hot there, so there was no ice there. The brown-haired man smiled widely, saying that if not, they could make it themselves. Her frowned in confusion, looking at the brown-haired man, asking how. The young master continued to smile, saying that, whatever. Herod looked at the protagonist wearily. The brown-haired man continued to force a smile onto his face. Music. The orc narrowed his eyes, wondering if he had brought home a crook, and maybe the story about the queen was a lie. The protagonist smirked slightly. The system notified that Harach was not as stupid as he thought. Lloyd said for the system to close, and he never, ever thought that it was just her thoughts. The system said that it was not at all, and it was he who thought he was stupid. Lloyd noted that the level of sympathy was SLL much more important, or rather, the client was more important. Herod began to shake his head from side to side. He thought that Lloyd had saved him, and he should not have thought badly of him. The young master waved goodbye to the orc. The Chiane's son said that if he needed help, he could call at any me. The protagonist told him not to worry and wait on law. The work was finished. Xavier looked at the protagonist with curiosity, asking where they would get ice. Lloyd stood motionless with his hand raised. ARR, which he looked back in confusion, saying that he was also interested in where. Xavier looked at the protagonist in bewilderment, knowing that these were the eyes of a man who did not know what to do. The knight looked at the young gentleman with concern, asking him that he had signed a contract without a concrete plan and that he was going to cheat them. The swordsman's eyes widened in surprise. Lloyd asked if he knew the first signs of failure. The protagonist slightly opened his mouth, saying that he couldn't do this. He couldn't do that. He held his hand out in front of the knight, saying that there would definitely be a lot of reasons. So, there was no need to act like that, and that without trying, you wouldn't know if it would work or not. The protagonist looked at the swordsman with a confident look, saying that the one who would succeed would be the one who would be open to everything new and try to fix the situation on. Lloyd, music, clenched his hand into a fist, saying that he called this Innova on. The young gentleman raised his fist, knowing that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. The brown-haired man stood motionless in front of the swordsman. Xavier looked at the guy with indignation, thinking that this was impossible and that such an undertaking had a higher chance of failing. A full moon was visible in the night sky. The protagonist looked though only ahead while sitting on a rock. The protagonist closed his eyes, thinking that everything was right and that he would first make a huge ice cube. Lloyd imagined Bell and Pidong pouring water into a container. He noted that Pidong and Bell would first bring water from the lake. The protagonist imagined the image of a magician who had conjured ice. He noted that ice magic existed in this world, wondering music what its principle was. The brown-haired man rested his head on his fist. He thought about magic and the free use of mana, and a technique based on freely changing the flow of mana. The brown-haired man imagined the image of a parlay of magic. He noted that he was sure that this was possible due to daily training in absorbing mana, and that there were several types of natural mana. Orange parlays of mana moved in space. A bright flash of mana occurred in space. The protagonist noted that in this way, changes depended on the nature of mana. The young master pressed his lips together, which he grinned mischievously, thinking that, of course, he couldn't use mana as he wanted. Tadang and Bell were moving towards the protagonist, who was calling them. Lloyd leaned towards the water container, thinking that he could do something similar. The young master dipped his hand into the water, thinking about Asrahan's mind technique, absorbing mana. The protagonist spread his fingers in the water, knowing that if he took away all the heat energy, then only cold energy would remain in the water. Blue parlays of energy floated towards the young master's palm. Lloyd noted that he did everything the other way around, and it wasn't that easy. Xavier leaned towards the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched the scene intently, thinking that he was being open-minded and trying to fix the situation, and he thought he was being unreasonable. The knight pursed his lips, thinking that he was also being irresponsible. The protagonist was gathering magic parlays with a concentrated look. The swordsman noted that he was really trying to find a way out with dignity. Xavier sighed heavily, thinking that he couldn't understand him. A blue aura began to emanate from the protagonists. The system notified that he had developed a new skill thanks to Azrahan's mind technique. The system notified that the level had increased. Azrahan's mind technique, double rings, level 2. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. A couple of days later, Akuch and Herods looked at what was happening in surprise. There were ice cubes in the room. The Chie, Ain, asked what he had go and the ice from. The brown-haired man tapped his hand on the ice, saying that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the insula on. The orcs looked at the ice happily. Akuch noted that there was a lot of space there and they would no longer have to throw away meat. Her noted that they would no longer have to hunt every day. Lloyd watched what was happening with a satisfied grin. The Chi-Ain said that they should celebrate and that Herod should gather the people. The Chi-Ain's son said that it was wonderful. The young gentleman looked at the knight with a sly grin, which he raised his index finger. thinking that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. Xavier closed his eyes and spread his arms out to the sides. No NG that he was not arguing. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The chief said that their Steel Sand tribe thanked him. The protagonist slightly bowed, saying that there was no need for gratitude and that he was only following the terms of the contract. Lloyd Front got 120 workers. Pakuch pressed his fist to his chest, saying that the orcs were different from humans and they did not do this for the sake of a contract. Bo looked at the guy with a serious look. No NG that, because they were sincerely grateful to him. That is why he Akats from the Steel Sand tribe promised him. The chief stood in a pompous stance, saying that from now on, the Lloyd Frontera family and the Steel Sand tribe, music, the orcs showed off their muscles, clenching their hands into fists. Package said that he was announcing an alliance that was stronger than Bloodess. The boys looked at the orcs in confusion. The Chi-Ain looked at the young master with a confident look, knowing that they proclaimed Fretter as their friend. Frontera's enemies were their enemies, and if he needed them, he should just call and they would come. The protagonist looked at the system window in surprise. The system notified that the tribe had become available, and the orc tribe had accepted him as a true friend. The system notified that he could strengthen his kinship by using the orc's RP, bonus RP, for opening the tribe plus 100. The amount of RP was 611. The protagonist's mouth dropped open in surprise. He clenched his fist and smiled broadly, saying that the Steel Sand tribe was cool. White clouds floated above the ground. Lloyd noted that they had once again set off on a long journey and returned home. The villagers watched the events in shock. The protagonist noted that, of course, the people were shocked. The protagonist was walking in the company of orcs. He noted that watching 120 units of living muscle come to the village, the young gentleman smiled in confusion, thinking that he should write an official appeal to calm the people down, because most ON orcs are seen in a bad light. The protagonist's parents watched the crowd of orcs in horror. The young gentleman noted that even though the Baron was aware of his wanderings, he froze in place as soon as he saw the orcs in person. The system notified that the wonderful story of Defea, Ung the magician, and saving the soldiers had spread throughout the area, and the inhabitants of the estate were praising him for his noble courage. The system notified that he had received bonus RP for achievements in society, plus 300. The amount of RP is 911. The young gentleman noted that besides, he did not even hope to receive a bonus, and he asked to stop praising him, but thank for the RP, there were vials of liquids on the table. The protagonist noted that the Baron said that he would look for a rich buyer to sell what they got from the orcs, and only the magic things of Ruffin remained. The protagonist looked at the golden sphere with curiosity, AER, which he began to dig into the book. Xavier asked if he found anything that could be sold. The protagonist said that he did not know, and he was trying to figure out if they could use them as something before selling them. Music. The protagonist looked at the book in shock, wondering what it was. AR, which he abruptly jumped up, saying that he urgently needed to go to the mines and let him clean up AR him there. The protagonist ran along the road to the mines. He began to frantically look around, asking where Thords was. Thords approached the protagonist with an exhausted look, asking what he was looking for. The young gentleman said that he had good news. The guy looked at the young gentleman with an exhausted look. Lloyd asked if he remembered the details of their contract and that he would have to work for him for 520 years. The worker said that he remembered. The brown-haired man smiled widely, asking, in fact, what was the point of this? No, none, that all these conditions were too ridiculous. Thords looked at the brown-haired man in surprise. The protagonist said that now he had nothing to worry about. The hero pointed to the book, saying that it said how to revive a dead person. Thords looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The main character smiled widely, saying that this meant that he would not be able to work the en return, asking if he was happy and wasn't it fun. The guys stood motionless, looking at each other. Lloyd looked at the guy with a terrifying look, asking what was funny only to him, ordering the guy to smile. The worker looked at the young gentleman in a daze, A-A-R, which he smiled widely as tears flowed from his eyes. The young gentleman winked at the guy, telling him not to be so sad. Lloyd walked to the exit, raising his fist up, telling him to be cheerful. The system announced that the King of Hell himself was impressed by his efforts and was already thinking of offering him a job. Lloyd told him to slam it shut, asking what was so funny about it. The protagonist walked with a wide smile. The system agreed with the protagonist. White clouds floated above the estate. The brown-haired man walked along the corridor of the building, thinking that now he needed to discuss something with the Baron. The main character looked into the room, wondering why he was not there. The maid approached the young gentleman, saying that the Baron was receiving guests in the hall. Lloyd asked about the guests. The protagonist stared at the servants. The girl said that Mr. Shalo and Meatloaf were there. The protagonist continued to stare at the girl A-E-R, which his face twisted into a mad smile. The girl wondered what was wrong with his face. There was a bow full of candles hanging on the wall. Meatloaf said that, as he already knew, he usually did not require the principal amount of the debt to be repaid in a lump sum. Orcus sat opposite the men, leaning slightly. Meatloaf said that, however, they could allow him to pay 10% of the debt. Meatloaf smiled maliciously, saying that if he transferred the ownership of the mine to them, the Baron looked down nervously. The man asked why he was silent, knowing that for him this was the best offer. The Baron looked at the door in surprise when the protagonist said it was him asking if he could come in. Arcus said that he could of course come in. The protagonist, with a wide smile, and looked into the room, saying, "What kind of Minung is this?" asking how they are doing. The man with a displeased face showed the paper to the protagonist, said that if he came to threaten them again, then it is better for him to leave immediately, since they have permission. The brown-haired man said that who would doubt it in how smart it is. The young gentleman smiled widely, saying that it can be concluded that they complained with a very good offer, asking nothing if he makes a counteroffer. Meatloaf looked at the guy with irrita on, said that he is not going to listen to this idiot. The protagonist said that in the future they will pay off the debt in installments, but of course they cannot lower the interest. The enraged man pointed his finger at the protagonist, saying that he does not want to listen, asking how dare he. The main character smiled widely, asking what can be offered, but he cannot, adding that he is furious. An orc's leg appeared in the room. An enraged Harach appeared behind the protagonist, asking who had angered his brother, Fra, Meatloaf, and Sho looked at Harach in horror. The Chi-Ain's son incinerated the man with a furious look. He said that the Steel Sand tribe would destroy anyone who made Fra suffer. Lloyd smiled widely, lightly. Hainung, the orc on the chest. He asked his friend what he was talking about, knowing that nothing terrible had happened. The Chi-Ain's son said that it hadn't happened at all, and that he looked angry. The protagonist noted that the man had simply raised his voice a lile. Shallow and Meatloaf were shaking in horror. Lloyd told them to ignore him, asking how they liked his offer. The young master continued to smile. Music, saying that if they refused him, Her looked at the men with a terrifying look, while the protagonist smiled madly. The brown-haired man said that he would be deeply offended. Her said that if they dared to upset Lloyd, he would tear them apart. The two men ran out of the estate in horror. The protagonist held a paper in his hands, looking at it. He said that he would like to make it so that there would be no more for along me, but this is impossible, so he must be content with what he has. The Baron thanked the protagonists. The young master looked at the defense with a smile, saying that orders for the construction of the system are growing and coal mining is in full swing, and they will be able to quickly pay them off. Brown-haired handed the paper to Arcus, knowing that he should not lose this contract. Arcus looked at the protagonist in surprise. The hero said that they have worse problems, and if they do not solve them, then they will have a hard me. Brown-haired pointed his finger at the Chi-Ain's son, saying that the orcs consume 10 mies more food than they do. Arcus looked at the protagonist in horror. The young gentleman noted that their food expenses were no joke, but they would not be able to let them go. The menacing orc swung the poker. The protagonist noted that, as he had expected, orcs made excellent miners. The orc struck the ground with a furious blow. The worker pointed the orc out to the protagonist. Lloyd asked where he was. The worker said that this orc, he works non-stop for 24 hours. The soldiers began to drag the orc away. The protagonist told them to take him away from there and make sure he didn't show up there on tomorrow. The orc screamed that he didn't want to rest and wanted to work on his muscles weakened. The young master noted that their productivity was 10 mays higher than he expected, and their endurance and strength were beyond description. Haraj looked at the protagonist in surprise, asking what he was talking about money, knowing that orcs didn't need money. The protagonist noted that they didn't even have to pay money every month. However, the Chi-Ain's son slapped his stomach, saying that he just needed to feed them enough. The protagonist noted that this wasn't exactly a common problem. The brown-haired man sat on the couch and noted that they would have to raise taxes very much. The Baron looked at the protagonist in confusion. Shayan said that they would buy orc meat with this money. Considering the productivity of the mines, they would not go into the Negave. Arcus said that he understood him. Then he looked down at the floor, adding that one could not be sure that the inhabitants of their settlement would be able to afford it. No, that it was very difficult to make a decision, and they could not charge such a high tax. The hero smiled slightly, saying that if they constantly raised the tax, it would be robbery. What were they losing? Because they would work hard, and they could suffer losses if the amount of tax paid decreased. The Baron looked at the protagonist with curiosity, asking how exactly they would raise taxes. Then Shayan said that everything was simple, and they would allow them to earn more money. The protagonist presented an image of a swamp, saying that the abandoned land in the north of the Settlement, they would turn the Moor's wetlands into a farm. The young gentleman smiled confidently, raising his index finger. He said that they would give it to the people, and they would grow different crops, make a lot of money, and pay taxes. There was a beautiful orange sunset in the sky. The protagonist stepped on the water. Lloyd and Xavier walked through the swamp. Xavier noted that it had been several hundred years since this land was abandoned, asking how people would be able to grow anything in such a place. The brown-haired man said that his big boss had an idea. The guy grinned in confusion, thinking that he said so, but it would not be easy. The protagonist was seen near the sand, filled with water. He noted that many things need to be taken into account because the territory is not small and they need to come up with a system for carefully draining rainwater. The protagonist made small walls out of sand, knowing that there was no other choice and would have to simulate a possible op-on. The protagonist was Sinung in the middle of water and land. Lloyd asked what if he did this, knowing that it was a failure. The young gentleman asked what might be too high, and then perhaps like this, knowing that he had messed up again. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The protagonist was assembling a tower out of the ground with an exhausted look. The Baron and Xavier were watching what was happening. Arcus asked how many days had passed. The swordsman noted that it had been 21 days. Xavier looked at the Baron and said that he barely ate or slept, asking what he should leave him. Arcus said that there was no need to do that. The protagonist stood with a shovel and a bucket in his hands. Arcus said that he hated him, even though he was his son, and wondered if he would ever become a normal person and whether it was impossible. The protagonist pursed his lips, bending over to the ground. The Baron noted that now, for the sake of others, he was trying to bring about amazing changes. Arcus looked down with a sad look, saying that perhaps he could not help him in any way, but he was not going to interfere either. Xavier watched the protagonist closely, saying that it was a wise decision, and right now young Master Lloyd was responsible for his words and would not give up. The protagonist bared his teeth, looking at the ground with a serious look. The system notified that the level of sympathy and Baron Arcus for him increased. He received 20 RP level 931. The leaves on the trees rustled in the wind. The protagonist fell to his knees, air, which he clenched his hand into a fist and raised it up. The young master clenched his teeth, raising his hands up. He noted that it should absorb, and then the water would drain as it should. The brown-haired man imagined falling gold coins, thinking that if they dealt with the water, they would be able to raise taxes. The brown-haired man imagined honey pouring on him. He thought about heavenly life. The protagonist stood motionless, with his hands raised, AER, which he collapsed to the ground. Lloyd smirked, knowing that he was exhausted, but it was bearable. And if you compare it to how he worked at night and got by with part-me jobs. Lloyd looked at the system window in shock. The system notified that his unusual experience had affected the design skill, and a new skill was available to him. The protagonist looked at the system window with curiosity. It said that the design skill Personal Choice 3, Modeling Mode, and modeling is possible by manipula and the collected data. A green diagram appeared in front of the young gentleman. He picked up a piece of land on the diagram with his hands. That stones fell from the top of the diagram. The brown-haired man looked at the system window in fury. The system window notified that he himself said that it was bearable. The protagonist said that he should have told him earlier because he was there for a month, adding that he meant it, asking if he knew how hard it was for him. The system notified that the skill can be visible due to the acquired wisdom. In this case, the reason was his desires. The protagonist squinted at the system window. He asked that when he first appeared there, what was his desire? Lloyd told him to just be honest, asking that he himself did not know and how his desire was connected with his appearance in this world. The young gentleman looked ahead in bewilderment. He said that he just wanted to graduate from college, get a license, get a job in a good company, and not think about money. Asking that is not what he wanted. The system notified that this is just his goal, and desire is much stronger, something that overcomes space and me. The main character slightly rose, shaking off the dust from his clothes. He said that if he was going to talk about the transience of life, it would be beer to stop this conversa on, because right now he is busy. Lloyd opened his mouth when Belle and Piedong appeared on his shoulders. The protagonist called out to the guys. Lloyd looked at Belle with a smile, asking that maybe it was me to meet new friends. A bright sun was visible behind the mountains. The protagonist stood near the swamp, saying that this was the first step of their project. The rodent and the snake looked at the protagonist in shock. The young gentleman said that they needed to pump out all the water from there. The rodent began to wave its paws nervously. Lloyd asked that the two of them couldn't handle it. No, none that, of course. The brown-haired man put the small snake on the ground, saying that it meant that they would draw. The guy looked into the distance with a confident look, knowing that he would use all his RP and draw as many creatures as he could. A system window appeared in front of the protagonist. The brown-haired man said to show it. Random selection of a Mizcal creature, one choice equals 100 RP. The protagonist thought that since the price would increase by 1.5 mez with each choice, he would be able to get 4 creatures. The main character pressed the start button on no NG, that he did not need any special skills. The young gentleman stood with his back turned, knowing that it would be beer to have huge creatures like Peepadong and Belle pump out the water, adding that it was somehow loud. The main character began to speak in an incomprehensible language. A green magic circle appeared in the air from which a head appeared. A creature flew out of the magic circle, AER, which had hit the main character in the face. A small yellow ball bounced on the ground. A small hippopotamus stood on the ground, looking at the main character. The young gentleman looked at the creature in shock, asking not to tell him that it was a hippopotamus. Dong and Belle looked happily at their new friend. The small hippopotamus smiled widely, waving its paws. The animals began to circle happily. The main character leaned towards Hippo, saying that he did not want to distract them, asking if he could show him the instructions. Hippo spat out the paper from his mouth. Lloyd noted that he had already gotten used to it. Music. The protagonist unfolded the wet leaf. He narrowed his eyes, asking that it would not grow even if fed a sunflower seed. Hippo looked at the protagonist with a joyful smile. Lloyd wondered if he had really missed something me. The hero crossed his arms and looked thoughtfully at the animal, and it smiled at its new owner. Lloyd turned away and said that he would like to try again. "Nosi, the choice of a fantasy creature is available only once a day." The guy disappointedly mewed that he had only wasted his me. Peong and Belle stood up for their Leela friend, saying that the aristocrat was behaving rudely. The guy sat down next to them and explained that there was only more work to do, and Hippo was too small to be useful. The hamster and the snake actively protested. The hero hastened to calm them down. He looked at the new pet and asked what skill it had and if it could absorb at least the moisture from his clothes. A sign appeared above the creature. Skill 1 Me, Level 1. The boy leaned forward and asked if the beast could really absorb water at once. He wondered how much. Hippo patted his stomach with a smile, and the brown-haired boy guessed that it meant 4 messer, the capacity of his stomach. Lloyd smiled lightly and looked away, thinking that he had and all the necessary skills so far. You could say he was lucky. The animal erected on and went to the water to demonstrate the skill. It bent down and began to drink. The boy stood and watched intently, along with the other 2 creatures. The boy raised his eyebrows, questioningly. The pet had grown larger. The hero squinted, trying to figure out if he was imagining things. Hippo continued to drink. With each sip, the baby became larger. The brown-haired man gradually raised his head, looking at the animal. Now it had reached a colossal size, and there was almost no water. Hippo rose and exhaled. In front of them was a dried-up crater where a fish was splashing pie fully. The guy stared ahead in amazement, not understanding how such a quantity of water could be drunk in such a short period of me. That meant they could dry it all up in a couple of days. Peong and Belle chuckled arrogantly, showing the owner how wrong he was. The young man smiled awkwardly and apologized to the system as well. He asked if the choice was really random since only the skills he needed appeared as if by a click. The message said that when the hero first appeared in this world, his skills appeared one another. Since his role as a person with an unenviable fate could bring him too much trouble, he must have developed the draw for luck skill. However, that might not be the case. The boy looked at the system window and mewed that the system was somehow negligent in explaining. Hippo looked at the owner and squeaked. The hero asked if he really wanted to drink more. The brown-haired man looked up decisively and allowed him to drink as much as he wanted because their construct starts tomorrow. The water was gradually draining. The boy planned to start the construct with the vertical drainage method. The workers looked up at the huge animal in shock. First, Hippo would pump out all the water from the swamps, then drain it into the river and become small again. Then, the workers would loosen the soil and remove the roots and remains of plants. The men worked hard, and Xavier stuck his sword into the ground, using an explosion. Next, they needed to dig holes where they would insert bamboo poles. They would need to make sand pegs and ask Pipadong to compact the earth. As soon as the water collected inside the bamboo poles, it would be me for Hippo's powerful blow. Then, they would build a more reliable storage facility using his modeling skill. The work was in full swing under the command of the aristocrat, and so 10 days passed. The first part was completed. Music. The hero raised his hand and shouted that they Zlol had a long way to go. But when the work was done, they would have a party, so they had to try hard. The workers happily supported their boss and got motivated. A cicada was chirping on a tree, and Xavier, all sweaty and half-naked, stood and looked at the field. The guy leaned on a shovel and thought that this abandoned area was really turning into farmland. He looked at the tool with displeasure and wondered, since when he started working on a construct on site, it seemed like there was another task. The knight looked at the gentleman running up. Lloyd handed him a bag of seeds and ordered him to plant them *NG from that end. The interlocutor asked why the knight should do this. The young man answered that it was to drive away various pests and protect the estate. The blonde agreed. The swordsman squatted down and watered the beds. He looked ahead with an empty gaze and thought that he had been interrupted again. Next, music me. The guy decided to make an excuse. The knight turned around at the voice. No, nung, that. The swamps were indeed turning into rice farms. The baron and his wife approached the guy. The man said that he was sure that people had heard about this. It was some kind of miracle. In front of them were fields where red but cheerful people were working. The protagonists walked nearby, supervising and direct nung. No fika on. The people of Fron Erus show their admira on and respect for the miracles you have created. You will be awarded a decent amount of RP as a bonus for success in society. Receive plus 450 amount of RP. 1,281. The young man grinned contentedly, throwing the shovel over his shoulder. Dragonflies flew above him, and clouds lazily floated across the sky. Sprouts appeared from the ground. Xavier sat down with a watering can, and looking at the plants, smiled with susfakon. Lloyd sat next to him, crossing his legs. He said that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the water wheel. The knight looked at him and asked again. The hero smiled and said that during the rains the water would have to be put somewhere, otherwise their lands would be flooded. He went down to the beds and added that they needed a specialist. The interlocutors turned questioningly at the sound. People on horseback were approaching them. The hero looked at them indifferently and asked who it was. The knight answered that it was Viscount Racona. His estate was north of these swamps. The horse stopped, and the man riding closer asked who was responsible for this construct on. Xavier frowned and made a remark to him to speak more politely. The hero stopped him with a smile and replied that he was the boss here. The boy asked why they had come. The man frowned and said that these lands belonged to Viscount Racona and ordered them to leave this place immediately. The boy and his swordsman looked at the newcomers with displeasure. The Merez swamps. This place had been abandoned for several hundred years. In the north, these lands are in the possession of Viscount Racona, and the southern part of the swamps belongs to Fronta. It is obvious that he is not just laying claim to them. Apparently, the nobleman wanted to take possession of the Ferlelans. The hero narrowed his eyes and thought that the man could really insist on transferring the lands for his use because, in fact, the northern part belonged to him. He grinned and added mentally that it had been like that now. The hero stood in front of the guests. Music. The boy clarified whether the Viscount was really claiming that they had entered his territory without permission. The nobleman's subordinate frowned and confirmed that these lands had been granted to the Viscount by the king himself. Lloyd frowned and said that the conversation should be conducted between people of equal status and suggested that the interlocutor shut up. The man's face distorted with anger. The workers stared at them in shock, and the Viscount grimaced. The brown-haired man bowed and apologized for not introducing himself earlier. He said that he was the eldest son of the Fronta family. Reconera raised an eyebrow and said that he had heard that the young man was behaving inappropriately. The man demanded that the hero call his father. Xavier frowned and thought that this was too rude, but Lloyd calmly began to pick his ear. The interlocutor repeated the order, but the young man said that he heard perfectly well. He blew on his finger and mooed that some kind of dung fly buzzed here. Racona looked around for the insect, and the servant whispered to him that he was the one who was insulted. The protagonist stopped smiling and said that the land law of the kingdom, Act number 321, a special law responsible for the kulva'on of marshland. The man looked at the young man with displeasure and demanded that he stop immediately. The brown-haired man konudquo nangarklewan, the purpose kulva'on of marshes that had been abandoned for a long me, establishing property rights to these lands. The interlocutor leaned forward and became indignant, but the young man did not stop. He closed his eyes and reported on the second arcle, the definition. Abandoned music lands are those on which no one has lived for the past 100 years and where no crops have been grown. Arcle 3. Property rights. Lands that meet all the requirements stated above pass into the possession of the one who cultivates them. The young man raised his finger and said that, firstly, their money and labor were invested in these lands. Secondly, housing for people can be built on these lands. Thirdly, the development of long-term agriculture is possible. The man gritted his teeth in displeasure and sweated. The hero stepped forward and shoved his hands into his pockets to name the fourth point. He grabbed a bunch of grass and pulled an onion out of the ground. The boy said that all this was backed up by a special rule when the first harvest had already been reaped from these lands. Rakona looked at him in rage. The knight stared at the gentleman in amazement, remembering how he had said that the seeds would help repel pests. The youth smiled and congratulated the Viscount on witnessing the first harvest in the moor's swamps. He added that there was no charge for viewing. They were not that greedy. The interlocutor grimaced and ground his teeth, not understanding how this idiot knew all this and whether he had prepared in advance. The boy thrust the onion at the man and generously allowed him to take it as a ghee. Lloyd looked menacingly at the nobleman and demanded that he leave their territory.